When preachers and Bible teachers discuss the story of the woman at the well in John chapter 4, a familiar claim often emerges. In the first century, Jews would travel around Samaria rather than through it because they hated the Samaritans so much. This interpretation has become so widespread and repeated with such authority that it has achieved the status of accepted historical fact, even though it lacks primary source documentation. As we slow down and look carefully, the reality is far more complex than this traditional sermon illustration suggests. The short answer is no. There are no primary historical sources indicating that Jews regularly avoided Samaria as a destination or as a travel route. In fact, the available evidence from Josephus, rabbinic literature, and the New Testament consistently shows that traveling through Samaria was normal and customary in the first century. With that in mind, let's look at the primary evidence. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, provides the most explicit evidence. In Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, section 118, he states, "It was the custom of the Galileans, when they came to the holy city at the festivals, to take their journeys through the country of the Samaritans. This is not describing an unusual or exceptional route. Josephus calls it the custom, meaning the established practice." Josephus further clarifies in Life, section 269, why this route was preferred. He explains that for rapid travel, the route through Samaria was essential because it allowed people to reach Jerusalem in about 3 days from Galilee. The most direct and fastest path passed through Samaritan territory. Although the journey could be dangerous at times due to ethnic tensions that occasionally flared into violence, the route itself was still standard practice, not a rare exception. As another example, Josephus records a specific historical incident around the year 52 involving violence at the Samaritan village of Jema. A group of Galilean pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for a festival were attacked, resulting in casualties. Importantly, Josephus does not present their presence in Samaria as unusual. Instead, he uses the incident to illustrate why travel through Samaria could sometimes be dangerous, not to suggest that Jews avoided it altogether. Tanaitic rabbinic sources, which reflect early Jewish tradition from around the 1st century, also support regular travel through Samaria. The Jerusalem Talmud records instances of rabbis traveling to Samaritan towns without presenting this travel as exceptional or prohibited. For example, one account says, Rabbi Shimon ben Eleazar went to a certain town inhabited by Samaritans. Another says, Rabbi Ishmael ben Yosei went to the town of Neapolis, which is modern-day Nablus in the heart of Samaria. None of these stories suggest such travel violated Jewish custom or law. In fact, the Tosefta in Avodah Zarah, chapter 3, section 1, explicitly states that Jewish herdsmen were permitted to leave cattle in Samaritan care when driving herds through the region. This kind of practical arrangement only makes sense if Jewish movement through Samaria was common. Even more striking, the Tosefta in Mikvaot, chapter 6, section 1 says, Samaritan territory is ritually clean, and its ritual immersion pools, dwellings, and paths are assumed to be clean. Considering how central ritual purity was to Jewish life, this ruling shows that travel through Samaritan land did not pose ritual problems. Another passage in the Jerusalem Talmud says that cooked food prepared by Samaritans was permitted. Such openness is not compatible with the idea that Jews avoided the area entirely. The New Testament itself provides several clear examples showing that travel through Samaria was ordinary. John chapter 4 verse 4 states that Jesus had to pass through Samaria on his journey from Judea to Galilee. The geography explains this statement. The road through Samaria was simply the direct route. Luke chapter 9 verses 51 to 56 and chapter 17 verses 11 to 19 also describe Jesus and his disciples traveling through Samaria as part of their normal movement. In the book of Acts, chapter 8 records Philip, Peter, and John traveling through Samaria to preach and minister. Nothing in the text suggests that such travel was unusual. Acts chapter 15, verse 3, mentions Paul and Barnabas passing through Samaria on their missionary journey. This again shows routine movement through the region. It is also worth noting that when Jesus met the Samaritan woman, his disciples were not shocked to be in Samaria. John chapter 4 verse 8 says, his disciples had gone into the town to buy food. Buying food in a Samaritan town shows ordinary commerce and everyday interactions, not strict avoidance. Many people point to John chapter 4 verse 9 as proof that Jews avoided Samaria. The verse says, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. But you know this phrase requires careful interpretation. Most scholars view this as John's editorial explanation. The Greek word translated have no dealings refers to sharing together in the sense of intimate fellowship. It does not mean total separation, avoidance, or refusal of basic contact. In practical terms, Pharisaic tradition discouraged eating and drinking together, borrowing or lending, accepting personal favors, and close friendship or social intimacy. However, it permitted business transactions, buying and selling, travel and lodging, and hiring Samaritan services. So the woman's shock in John chapter 4 verse 9 was not because Jesus was physically present in Samaria. Instead, it was because he treated her with respect, asked her for water, and crossed boundaries of intimacy and social custom. Another passage sometimes raised is Matthew chapter 10 verses 5 to 6, where Jesus tells the disciples not to enter Samaritan towns during their first preaching mission. But, honestly, this instruction was temporary. It was specific to that initial mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. After Jesus' resurrection, the mission expanded dramatically. In the Great Commission, Jesus commanded the disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, which clearly includes Samaritans. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus said they would be witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Acts chapter 8 shows Philip preaching in Samaria and Peter and John following to confirm the work. The early church understood Matthew chapter 10 verses 5 to 6 as a temporary directive, not as a permanent rule banning travel through Samaria. There's, another important factor that adds to the woman's surprise in John chapter 4, gender norms. In first-century Judaism, strong social rules really governed interactions between men and women. Rabbinic teaching actually discouraged men from speaking to women in public, even to their own wives. Some Jewish thinkers, like Philo, emphasize strict separation of the sexes in public life. So, in this context, the woman's astonishment makes perfect sense. Jesus broke not only an ethnic boundary but also a gender boundary. Her surprise came from at least 3 places. First, Jesus was a man speaking to a woman in public. Second, he was a Jewish man speaking to a Samaritan woman. And third, he asked her for a drink, creating an intimate act of exchange. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus consistently treats women with dignity and respect, teaching them, talking with them openly, and allowing them roles that went far beyond cultural expectations. To understand the relationship between Jews and Samaritans, we need to look at the history behind the tension. After the Assyrian invasion in 722 BC, foreign populations settled in the northern region, and the people who lived there eventually became the Samaritans. When the Jewish exiles returned from Babylon, they rejected the Samaritans' offer to help rebuild the temple because of concerns about their ancestry and worship. This rejection really deepened the divide. Later, the Samaritans built their own temple on Mount Gerizim, which was eventually destroyed by the Jewish leader John Hyrcanus. Religious differences also grew, including disagreements over scripture, worship practices, and the proper location of the temple. Despite these differences and tensions, no ancient source says Jews avoided traveling through the region. Some Jewish writings like Sirach express strong hostility towards Samaritans. Others, like Tobit and Jubilees, reflect tension between the groups. But none of these writings mention avoiding Samaritan territory. So, how did the idea that Jews avoided Samaria really take hold? Well, it likely developed for a few reasons. First, there's often a misreading of John chapter 4 verse 4. Then there's an assumption that hostility must mean geographical avoidance. Also, the dramatic appeal of the idea in sermons can make it stick. And of course, commentaries have repeated the claim without offering any primary evidence. Over time, repetition caused the claim to become accepted without much scrutiny. Modern scholars who specialize in early Judaism actually agree that Jews frequently traveled through Samaria. The combined evidence from Josephus, rabbinic literature, and the New Testament shows that Jews did not avoid the region. The most accurate picture is this. Jews and Samaritans had deep religious and ethnic tensions, and sometimes violence did occur. But despite the conflict, Jews still traveled through Samaria regularly because, well, it was the shortest route, economic needs required interaction, and practical life just made total separation impossible. Travel was, honestly, quite common. What was restricted, though, was close personal fellowship. Jesus' actions in John chapter 4 are remarkable not because he walked through Samaria, but because he engaged a Samaritan woman in a respectful, meaningful conversation that crossed both ethnic and gender boundaries. The claim that Jews traveled around Samaria instead of through it is not actually supported by ancient sources. Josephus describes travel through Samaria as the common custom. Rabbinic literature accepts such travel as well. The New Testament shows it happening without any surprise. Matthew chapter 10 verses 5 to 6 was a temporary instruction, not a permanent rule. While tensions between Jews and Samaritans were real, they did not produce systematic geographical avoidance. For Bible teachers and preachers, this distinction really matters. It helps us separate what ancient documents actually say from what later traditions have taught. The story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman remains powerful, not because he entered Samaria, but because he crossed social boundaries with grace, dignity, and truth, treating a Samaritan woman with honor when many in his culture simply would not have.